So here's something I've been thinking about. Union Pacific is trying to buy Norfolk Southern in an $85 billion deal that would create the first truly transcontinental railroad across the United States. But would that deal even be happening if the East Palestine derailment had not have happened? Norfolk Southern survived it, the railroad recovered, trains kept moving, but the Norfolk Southern that came out the other side of that derailment was a very different company. The board changed. The CEO changed. An activist investor got very involved. And just 2.5 years after the wreck, Norfolk Southern agreed to sell itself to Union Pacific. So, did East Palestine start a chain of events that eventually made this merger possible? Maybe. And I think it's worth looking at. My name is Mark Magana, and this is Railroad Economics, where we discuss the business behind the trains. First, I need to be careful here. I am not saying that East Palestine caused the Union Pacific acquisition of Norfolk Southern. There's no direct evidence of that. And Union Pacific has some very obvious reasons for wanting Norfolk Southern, and we'll get to that in a minute. But look at what happened to Norfolk Southern after February 3rd, 2023. The derailment was enormously expensive. By late 2024, NS had recognized roughly 1.5 billion in net expenses related to East Palestine. That's after insurance recoveries. There was a $600 million class action lawsuit. There were cleanup costs, legal costs, government scrutiny, and absolutely an enormous public relations problem. But Norfolk Southern, large successful railroad, they could afford it. This is one of America's largest railroads. East Palestine hurt the company, but it did not cripple it. Where things get more interesting is what happened next. Less than a year after the derailment, an investment firm called Ancora Holdings started buying Norfolk Southern stock. Eventually, it had a stake worth roughly $1 billion. Ancora is what's called an activist investor. Basically, an activist investor buys enough stock to get everyone's attention and then says, hey, I own part of this company. I don't like how X, Y, and Z are going down in the company. We're going to try to make some changes. And Ancora wanted to change a lot of things. They thought Norfolk Southern was underperforming, and they wanted CEO Alan Shaw replaced. They nominated their own candidates for Norfolk Southern's board of directors. And this is important. Ancora wasn't doing this because of East Palestine. Their complaints were much broader than that. They were unhappy with Norfolk Southern's operating performance, its expenses, and the returns the shareholders were getting. But East Palestine certainly didn't help Alan Shaw's position. He was running a railroad that had just experienced one of the most infamous derailments in American history. Norfolk Southern was spending enormous amounts of money trying to deal with it. Politicians were hauling railroad executives into Washington, and now an activist investor was telling shareholders, we think this company needs different leadership. That fight came to a head in May of 2024. Ancora tried to win enough seats to dramatically reshape Norfolk Southern's board of directors. They didn't quite get there. Alan Shaw survived, but Ancora did win 3 board seats. And I think that's an important moment in this story. They didn't take control of Norfolk Southern, but suddenly the people pushing for major changes at the railroad were sitting inside the boardroom. Things got even stranger. 4 months later, Alan Shaw was gone. Now, Shaw was not fired because of East Palestine, and I want to make that very clear. Norfolk Southern fired him after an investigation found that he violated company policy by having a consensual relationship with the company's chief legal officer. That is a completely different issue. Look, we've all worked at companies, most of us, big companies, small companies. Workplace relationships happen, but when you are at that high executive level, it's a much more dangerous thing. In the wake of that, Norfolk Southern's chief financial officer, Mark George, he became CEO. But just look at what's happened by this point. In less than 2 years, Norfolk Southern had gone through East Palestine, billions of dollars of financial exposure and commitments, a vicious proxy battle, three new directors on their board, and now there's also a new CEO. That's a lot of change for a company that had been pretty stable before all of this. Now, here's where the argument that East Palestine somehow broke Norfolk Southern falls apart because it didn't. Norfolk Southern actually recovered pretty well. Operations improved, traffic grew, its operating ratio improved substantially from really ugly numbers that were reported during the year of the derailment. This wasn't a wounded railroad sitting around waiting for somebody to rescue it. Norfolk Southern was still an incredibly valuable company with an incredibly valuable railroad, which is precisely why Union Pacific wants it. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern announced their deal on July 29th, 2025. The transaction values Norfolk Southern at an enterprise value of about $85 billion. So Union Pacific wasn't getting some distressed company at a discount. The deal represented a significant premium for Norfolk Southern shareholders because, from Union Pacific's perspective, Norfolk Southern solves one enormous problem. Union Pacific basically ends in the middle of the country. Norfolk Southern takes over from there and reaches many of the biggest markets in the East. Put those systems together, and you get more than 50,000 miles of railroad across 43 states, connecting the West Coast to the Midwest to the Southeast and the East Coast. The companies estimate the combination could eventually create about 2.75 billion a year in additional revenue and efficiencies. So let's answer half our question. Would Union Pacific want Norfolk Southern if East Palestine had not have happened? Yes, I think the answer is absolutely yes. The strategic logic is too obvious. East Palestine didn't make Norfolk Southern valuable to Union Pacific, geography does. But that's not the question I find interesting. The interesting question is, would Norfolk Southern have been willing to sell had East Palestine never have happened? And that question is impossible to answer. Imagine the wreck never happens. Norfolk Southern doesn't have to take a financial hit. Alan Shaw doesn't spend the next year dealing with one of the biggest railroad disasters in decades. Maybe Ancora still launches a campaign. Maybe they don't. Maybe those three board seats still change hands. Maybe they don't. Shaw's eventual firing was unrelated, so perhaps Mark George becomes CEO anyway. We can't know that for sure. We're talking about an alternate history that never happened, but we do know what actually happened. East Palestine was followed by one of the most turbulent periods Norfolk Southern ever experienced. The company went through enormous financial and political pressure. Shareholders revolted, the board changed, the CEO changed. And then 2.5 years after the derailment, Norfolk Southern's board unanimously agrees to sell the company to Union Pacific. So, no, I don't think East Palestine caused the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger. Union Pacific probably would have wanted this railroad anyway. But did East Palestine create the corporate environment where Norfolk Southern was finally willing to say yes? I think that's a much more interesting question, and we may never know the answer. I don't think there's any way we can, especially because as I'm recording this, Union Pacific doesn't own Norfolk Southern yet. The Surface Transportation Board is still reviewing the merger. So the final chapter of the NS story after East Palestine, it hasn't been written yet. A railroad economics viewer noticed something over at Norfolk Southern and suggested I look into it. And on the surface, I didn't really think there was much to it, but I did look into it and he was right. There is an interesting story there, and I'm going to cover that tomorrow because some of what they are saying and what they are doing with hiring, it's very, very strange. So we will look into that tomorrow. But for now, thank you so much for watching today's episode. My name is Mark Magana. This is Railroad Economics. Please like, subscribe, do all the things. I really I appreciate everybody that watches this channel. Thank you so much.